Hello, everybody. This is another episode of Socratic Circle Cinema. I'm your host, Jackson Rasco, and with me today is Connor Nielsen. Hello, Connor.
Hello.
So, what are we talking about today, Condog Millionaire?
Well, today we are going to be talking about film genre. We're going to first define what we think a film genre is, or at least how it pertains to us, because I think it's a pretty fluid thing to describe. And then when you actually try to break down what a genre is, I think that is pretty interesting. And then we're going to talk about our favorite and least favorite film genres. Not necessarily that we think these film genres are bad, but just that as they pertain to us, they're not necessarily the things we go out looking for.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, Rasco, what would you define as what a genre is?
Well, you see, it's going to be... It's really tough because typically if you ask someone what their favorite genre is, they'll go and they'll say something that would actually be considered a subgenre. So we had a discussion right before we started recording about what we consider to be like the main genres, and then like how certain subgenres are created by like when you combine two things together. So what was the example that you brought up a second ago about action and adventure? Explain that for a second. So
I think the action genre is a different genre than the adventure genre. And then I think the action-adventure genre is a different genre from both of those two. I know that sounds really weird, but the way I see it is an action movie is something like Die Hard or The Terminator. I've never seen Terminator 2, but from what I hear, it's a textbook action film. I know. Send your death threats to my YouTube page.
He lives in Oregon. Send them to Oregon.
But then an adventure movie is something like The Goonies. Then an action-adventure movie is something akin to Raiders of the Lost Ark or Indiana Jones or Lord of the Rings. But Lord of the Rings is more fantasy. But that's kind of the way I see it.
Yeah.
And we've gotten to a place where storytelling has gotten so layered that one movie can be a combination of other things. One of my favorite YouTubers is Leon Thomas, and he does the show Renegade Cut. And he has a really cool video called Is This a Horror Film? At which points he talks about how horror movies get discredited where they'll say, oh, I love the horror movie The Silence of the Lambs, and then somebody will say, but that's not a horror movie, that's a psychological thriller. And then he says, something can be equal parts psychological thriller and horror. And so I think that can be said about a lot of different movies now, where something can be a musical and a comedy and, a chick flick and something else. Like it can be so many different things.
Yeah. Two examples off the top of my head. Alien is a horror movie, both in tone, atmosphere, and structure, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also one of the most iconic sci-fi films. But I think at the end of the day, Alien is a horror movie more than it is a sci-fi movie.
I would agree. And what's funny about that particular example is I actually got into an argument with my father a couple years ago about whether that was a horror movie or a science fiction movie. And I was saying it's a horror movie, and he said it's a science fiction movie. And through the magical ways of father-son relationships, it got into a pretty heated argument.
And you punched him in the face.
Oh yeah, you know it. Knocked him on his face, and then he took off his belt and smacked me across the. Yeah, it got pretty intense. But at the end of the day, I kind of came to this conclusion that movie in structure is a horror film. Like, it is a haunted house monster movie.
Yeah.
Just on a spaceship. But it has the visual aesthetic of a science fiction film.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I've just kind of come to terms with as it's both, but I would lean more into the horror grounds because at its core, it's a horror story.
Yeah. And then another example that I had was The Nice Guys.
I love The Nice Guys.
I've seen a lot of people say that that's like an action movie that's got comedy in it. I don't think that's true. I think The Nice Guys is like a comedy first, like a crime mystery thriller second.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so like that's one where I think that movie, for the most part, that's pretty much a buddy comedy, right?
I would say so, and it comes from Shane Black, who loves blending genre.
Yeah.
So I guess if we're going to define genre, the way I would say is a genre is something that is classified by conventions, like recurring conventions, recurring cliches, and trappings.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would say it is. The Western has a very specific aesthetic.
Yeah.
Not only an aesthetic, but their stories have very similar conventions and
Themes.
story points and themes and structure that the Western became a genre. Same thing with comedy. Comedy structure has become, you notice the comedy structure, it's more than just this movie made me laugh and it's all about the jokes. It's a movie, like, comedies all the way back from, like, I don't know, Buster Keaton and like the Marx Brothers have a very specific structure, and you can kind of see that structure in modern day comedies. The humor and sensibilities have changed, but that structure is still there.
Yeah, I would agree. It's also kind of interesting to bring up that with genre, oftentimes just the setting is what will make people lean towards it being a specific genre.
Mm-hmm.
So like with Alien, like we were talking about a second ago, that's a case where, like, because it's set in a sci-fi setting, people jump to that's a sci-fi movie, but it fits the mold of a horror film better. But because of the setting, people assume that it is a sci-fi film. Now, if you go to like something like the Western genre, it's not just that Westerns take place in the Wild West. It's that they revolve around very specific conventions, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to have a Western that's not a Western? Like Cowboys versus Aliens. Is that a Western or is that a sci-fi? I would say that's more of a sci-fi in a way.
I would say it's a Western movie that kind of, and you have to remember, I haven't seen Cowboys and Aliens since the theaters.
I haven't either, so I'm just like,
I remember because that movie starts off with a man with no name, wakes up in the middle of nowhere, has no idea how he got there, meets a band, comes across a quiet town with, a bunch of colorful characters, and then they come together to stop an oncoming threat. Like, that's Magnificent Seven. Well, not really Magnificent. The whole, like, defending the city is kind of Magnificent Seven, but even like looking at Magnificent Seven or Seven Samurai, those have the structure there that is Westerns, and it has those same conventions. And I think, there is some B horror movie stuff in there. And, of course, that same kind of B horror sensibilities and those kinds of films were around at the same time the Westerns were very popular. So it is a bit of genre blending, but I would say it is more of a Western due to structure. And I think ultimately structure is really what genre is built around. And when we talk about like horror sci-fi or horror comedy, there's also one genre that I think is one of the oldest examples of genre blending that's really just become a genre unto itself, and that's the romantic comedy. But romantic comedy has stood the test of time in a way, and it's evolved unto its own thing, kind of like action adventure, where if you look at something like Sing Street, it's comedic and it's romantic, but it doesn't adhere to the comedy structure and the romance structure. It is a weird blending of both. And if you haven't seen Sing Street, you totally should, because it's the best movie of the year.
It's pretty freaking great. So
You looked up on Google before we started chatting, and you found a list of genre
yeah, I actually have
before
it right here.
subgenre, and you want to read those through?
Yeah, okay. So these are, if you just Google main film genres on Google, you'll find this list. And so it says action, adventure, comedy, crime and gangster, drama, epics slash historical, horror, musicals slash dance, science fiction, war, and westerns. And then if you go over, it's got a list of subgenres. So it's got biopics, chick flicks, courtroom dramas, detective and mystery, disaster, fantasy, film noir, guy films, melodramas slash weepers, road films, romance, sports, superheroes, supernatural, thriller slash suspense.
And that's interesting because guy movies and chick flicks are probably at a lower tier than something like disaster or noir. And I think, road films are generally lumped into comedies, but the road movie has its own specific structure. And
Yeah.
that's interesting that the way certain things are classified, you just looked on Google, but the American Film Institute, almost a decade ago, when they released their AFI Top 100 10th Anniversary Edition, they had a bunch of other lists as well. And one of them was the 10 Top 10, where they called it the 10 genres.
Yeah.
And then they had the top 10 movies in that particular genre. And I'm going to not go through every single movie, but I'm going to give you the 10 genres they went with because I think it's interesting. And you actually had a discussion with Captain Logan about this. The first one is animation.
Mm-hmm.
Just animation as a genre. And I know you had a discussion with Captain Logan about that. The second one is fantasy. The third one is gangster. The fourth one is science fiction. The fifth one is western. The sixth one is sports. 7 is mystery. 8 is romantic comedy. 9 is courtroom drama, because that is different from drama. And number 10 is epic. And it's funny because when I think epic movies, I always thought epic was kind of a subgenre because a movie was, say, an adventure film before it was an epic adventure film. I think the epic does have to adhere to certain rules, like it needs, in my eyes, there's nothing can be an epic if it's longer than 2.5 hours. Like if it's longer than 2.5 hours, then you maybe qualify for being an epic. It needs to have an intermission. And other little things like that, of course. There also has to be a certain amount of scale. There has to be a certain amount of, I want to say, self-importance to it. But
would you say there's a very defined 3-act structure within an epic?
Not really. Because if you look at Ben-Hur or Lawrence of Arabia or other epic films, and I'm talking about classic epics now, but Ben-Hur is so episodic in the way it rolls, because he'll kind of wander around, and at different points in his journey, he'll be hanging out with a different supporting actor or a different supporting character.
Mm-hmm.
And then he'll kind of go to the next part of his journey and then hang out with another supporting character for a little while. And he hangs out with 4 or 5 different people. So it's almost 5 different episodes that make up the journey of Ben-Hur, which, by the way, I can't believe they're remaking the 1959 version of Ben-Hur and it looks terrible. But the 1959, which is a remake of a remake, which was based off of a book of Ben-Hur.
Which is based off of a cave drawing.
Yeah. Which of course then that 1959 with Charlton Heston, directed by William Wyler, ended up becoming a stage play. But whatever. That's kind of a way to do an epic. It's because epic can also refer to episodic, and so I think I wrote a review for Ben-Hur that I haven't made yet, but I say that that's an epic in every sense of the word. It is grand in scale. It is episodic in nature, just by virtue of the way his journey is. So I don't think an epic needs to adhere to a specific 3-act structure.
But would you say that it has to have some sort of that it's broken up into smaller chunks in a way then?
Yeah, because I would say so. Then yeah,
Because
because
that's what I was thinking. Because like Superman the movie, that's like an epic in the way it's presented. It's got three very distinct parts that make up the whole.
mhm.
But I don't think it's necessarily that it's three parts as much as it is that it is broken up.
Yeah, and if you look at, say, Lawrence of Arabia, there's the sequence, there's the part where he's a general, then there's the part where he's wandering through the desert, then there's the part where he returns, and those are all broken up into specific chunks.
Alrighty then.
Is there anything you wanted to talk about as far as genre as a concept is concerned?
Um, I don't know. Are we just ready to go ahead and get into the our favorite and least favorite?
Yeah, I am.
All right, let's just go ahead and do that. You can go first.
You want to start with our favorite or our least favorite?
Start with our favorites actually, and then we'll get into our least favorites.
So this is interesting because there's my favorite kinds of stories, but my favorite kind of a story is like a man versus nature survival story. Like I know a lot of people don't really care for The Revenant. I don't know why, because that's a man versus nature survival story and it's awesome. So I'm just naturally attracted to that. And even something like The Shallows, which I completely acknowledge is not a great movie. I have a lot of fun watching that movie because it is the kind of movie I like. It's Blake Lively fighting off a shark. And by the way, sharks are my favorite animals. So right there, it's something that's appealing to me. But that is not something I would classify as a genre. It's just a kind of story to tell. My favorite genre as far as conventions and trappings and aesthetic go, I would say if I had to pick one, it would be science fiction. Um, Science fiction is something that I think you can get away with a lot, and not look ridiculous. Like you can do wacky, larger than life ideas and portray them in a way that doesn't seem so ridiculous. Because if you put it in this particular aesthetic, people will suspend their disbelief and buy something more than they would if it was, say, a drama, like spaceships and crazy aliens and like even stuff like social commentary. You can get away with it without seeming too cheesy because it's just part of the genre. And when you look at something like The Martian, there's a science fiction movie that is a man versus nature survival story, and that's one of those movies that I just instantly gravitated towards because it just has everything I like in there. Plus, it's got Matt Damon. I guess I'd go with science fiction, and you can blend it with so many other genres, and it's so flexible, and it's also something that can just be so itself, and it can also be something as far as it can be semi-realistic, like 2001: A Space Odyssey is something that there is no sound in space. It's all built on things that were theoretical and state-of-the-art theories about space travel. And to a lot of degrees, 2001 still holds up. But at the same end of this, but at the other end of the spectrum, you get something like Star Trek, which has all these wacky creatures, and it's a big space voyage. And then there's this the Federation of planets, and then you have it's like this big utopia. And then you also have something like Metropolis, which is one of the best movies ever made. If you haven't seen Metropolis, you totally should. But that's like a dystopia. But it's semi-grounded, but there's also like a world above ground, a world below ground. You have a robot walking around, a mad scientist. Everything's going to. It's crazy. That movie is insane. You should totally watch it. But you can do so much with the science fiction genre, and I guess that's why it's my favorite.
Okay, so now take science fiction, and what is a genre that you like it when science fiction is mixed with?
That's a good thing. That's a good
list
question.
a few if you want to.
As said before, like I really like The Martian, but that is not really blending itself with any other genre necessarily. It's just blending itself with a particular type of story I like.
Yeah.
But science fiction horror is something that I've always that's always appealed to me. But I also really like Blade Runner, which is sci-fi mystery. I guess if I had to pick one, I would. I really like science fiction fantasy, like Star Wars. And I know some people, a lot of people call Star Wars a Western in space, but I think when you kind of have that Western structure and character archetypes mixed in with the science fiction aesthetic, it almost becomes like a fantasy in a way.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and say my favorite, and this is going to be pretty much the exact same as you said. I would also say that science fiction is probably my favorite genre of film also, mainly because when you take science fiction, it's one of the easiest genres to just literally take it and mix it with something else and make something that is equally as interesting as any other main genre, I would say. So science fiction, horror, like you said, awesome. Alien, that's a perfect example of that. Science fiction,
Jason X.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. Science fiction adventure is one of my favorites. I know a lot of people don't really like the movie Prometheus, and I would agree it's not a great movie, but I'm really excited for Alien Covenant because that's going to be somewhat of a mix of science fiction, adventure, and horror, probably, which is similar to what Prometheus was. But I would classify Prometheus as adventure science fiction because it's about exploring this new world that they find out, and it's got a lot of the tropes of adventure. You've got like an exploration party that comes together and yada yada yada. I also really like science fiction and like crime drama.
Like Blade Runner.
Yeah, it's like Blade Runner. It's pretty much just the reason I like science fiction is because it's one of the most malleable genres of film, I would say.
I agree, and don't you think that science fiction allows you to get onto platforms that you just couldn't do in any other genre?
Yeah, it allows you to do social commentary in a way that's not too on the nose, or that like doesn't make people feel like they're being preached to.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also, I think, a really great way to put themes into the forefront. Again, like social commentary, without making it feel like, I don't know, like if you had a drama that was just like all theme and no story.
Yeah.
You can kind of get away with that in science fiction because you can just explore these ideas first and make it about these characters and these ideas before it's about any necessary plot. And I think you can get away with that to some degree.
Yeah, one of the things about science fiction is that science fiction allows you to explore an idea that people may have a very concrete position on. So it doesn't matter what relevant issue that exists in the modern world you're talking about or a debate that's being had. You can take that debate and place it in another context. And then when an audience member is watching this movie, they may not realize the ideas that are being explored until they've already, as an audience member, come to a conclusion in the narrative themselves. So, like, you present some sort of idea that exists in the real world, but because you place it in such a foreign context, it makes it so that the audience member doesn't even necessarily know that that's the idea that's being explored until they see it play out, and allows someone to get rid of their preconceived notions and positions when it comes to specific ideas and debates that are being had. All that gets stripped away because they're introduced to this new world, and then by the time that the story has come full circle, they may not even realize that they side differently than they used to side on a very specific issue or question.
And I know that's happened to me before. It's a very subversive way of getting your point across. I like it a lot.
Yeah, you trick people into considering opposition.
I tricked you into agreeing with me. Haha, reverse psychology.
Yeah. So do we want to go ahead and get into least favorite now?
Sure. This was classified as a subgenre, and I guess it might be, but I think there is no other genre like it where its trappings and structure are so specific that I can't really think of a more broad way to talk about it. It is a little specific, but my least favorite kind of movie is the disaster movie. which is a pretty thin line, more specifically 1990s disaster movies, as uh, the structure was defined by Roland Emmerich. The original Independence Day movie, I think, is just all right. It's kind of the one that gets away with a lot of the stuff that frustrates me about these movies. But the way the disaster movie was established, or I don't know, I can't really think of a disaster movie like pre 1990s. I never watched Poseidon Adventure. Like I never watched a lot of those classic disaster movies, but they really became popular in the 90s and throughout the 2000s. And I think a lot of the times disaster movies have really become a key part of like a Michael Bay big blockbuster. But the reason I don't like this specific genre very much, and I'm not saying I hate all disaster movies, but the reason it just doesn't appeal to me is usually it'll be a movie that's about 5 or 6 characters, each on their own little subplots, and they all have some kind of mutual connection, and we see this big disaster happening, and then we don't ever really get a whole lot of development on each of these characters. They're all usually pretty simple one-dimensional cutouts that are we're supposed to project our own preconceived notions onto of a very specific, like whether it be religious I'm trying to think of the specific, like if somebody is like kind of the stand-in for like the religious guy, or this person's a stand-in for the black community, or this person is the stand-in for women in general, or this person is the stand-in for the guy who likes cars. They're all thinly veiled, and they're all pretty simple, and we're just kind of supposed to bring in our preconceived notions of that specific culture, and kind of it's playing on stereotypes, I guess, but not really stereotype, more generalizations that we may or may not have. And we kind of fill in the blanks of these characters that the movie just isn't filling in itself. And then when the crap hits the fan, the aliens invade, the big tidal wave comes, everything freezes over, whatever happens. And the big carnage and everything ensues. And then I don't like how these movies then will like act like, these characters are going through these big emotional things and we're supposed to feel the same. It's so contrived, and most of the time it's contrived. And I haven't really seen any specific film that's made me think otherwise. I'm not saying like disaster movies are the ones that are always at the bottom of my list every year when of worst movies, but they're the movies I look forward the least to going to, and I always walk out and I don't feel anything.
Interesting.
What is your least favorite genre, Rasco?
Okay, so the thing is, I don't particularly hate any specific genre more than another by like a wide margin. It's all very much that like I like most genres of film. There's just the ones that I consistently come out of thinking that was terrible, or like that was irritating and annoying. And I've realized that I hate watching annoying movies more than bad movies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find the genre that most consistently produces annoying movies is probably comedy or romantic comedy. And that's not to say that there are not romantic comedies and comedies that I really like, because I do. If you guys haven't seen the movie Along Came Polly, that's a romantic comedy that is really, really funny. But oftentimes, this is the genre where it's kind of like the horror genre, where people can kind of just pump out crap that's terrible and obnoxious and lowest common denominator type of stuff. So I would say like rom-coms, probably my least favorite genre.
Interesting. All right.
But like I said, there are a lot of them that I really like. Like you were talking about Sing Street earlier. That's a great romantic comedy. It's just that there's so many, and more so than just romantic comedy, I do mean like comedy as an overarching genre, because there are so many bad comedies that get made, like that movie The Boss. What is that movie? Like Tammy.
We also get all these, like, we've been getting a lot of belated comedies as well, like Dumb and Dumber 2, Zoolander 2.
You also get it's the genre where you see the least artistic integrity and you see the least actual filmmaking techniques being used. So like, here's an example. So like the reason that I probably have such an issue with comedy and rom-com is that when they're done well, it's such a stark contrast between what the average one looks like. So a great romantic comedy is Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Yeah.
That is a movie that is just oozing with style and inspiration in every department, okay? It's great. That is a great movie. Scott Pilgrim versus the World is a near perfect romantic comedy. So when I see movies like that, I go, wow, what other romantic comedies are there of this quality? And I think about it, and I can list maybe like one every year, you know? Yeah. Whereas I can list like 10 absolutely garbage comedies.
Yeah, I mean, for every, I don't know, Scott Pilgrim versus the World and Sing Street, we get like All About Steve, or The Proposal. Or some other kind of generic fluff.
It's also really pandery. It's a very pandery genre.
It is. I recently watched Bad Moms, and that was one of those things where it's pandering to a specific demographic so hard that you can just see through the veil, and it's so phony. Yeah. But we don't get as much rom-coms as we did in like the 2000s. Nowadays we are, if anyone is curious, if anyone 10 years from now is listening, it is 2016, so maybe the rom-com made a comeback. But I remember in like 2010 or 2009, 2010 is really kind of when it fizzled out. Did you hear about The Millers, which had I want to say Hugh Grant, don't quote me on that, or did you hear about The Joneses, whatever it was? And then we had It's Complicated that had Steve Martin, Alec Baldwin, and Meryl Streep. And I remember there was like all of those rom-coms that had that similar aesthetic, and they all had the same poster, and they all had the same trailers. And there was a lot of them that came out of here, and they made a lot of money, but those were really kind of middle-budget films. And nowadays it's all about franchises, and the middle budget movie is disappearing. It's all now low budget or high budget, and everything in the middle is kind of going to Netflix or any streaming service or TV.
Yeah, it's really I mean it's one of those things where romance in particular is one of the most like complicated. If we're just talking about like a movie that has romance, as if you could classify something, like you can classify romance in a lot of different genres of film. Like you can attach romance to like action movies, but it doesn't necessarily make it a romantic action movie. Because that's like a trope of action movies oftentimes, is that there's like the girl or the love interest. But romance in comedy is oftentimes really annoying because they treat one of the most complicated parts of the human experience, which is romance, in such a like pretentious and false and shallow way in rom-coms. Yeah. Where it's like at the end of like every rom-com, you'll have like some dude and like he has the big confessing his love moment. I love you, Jillian. And like that's like you have that in so many romantic comedy movies, and when it's done well, it's so glaring because there's so many examples of when it's done poorly.
Yeah, there's the jerk boyfriend. There's schlubby hero man trying to get the girl, or other times, yeah, I've forgotten how much bad rom-coms can get.
Yeah.
But the thing about rom-coms, though, is when you find a really good one, you get them really good because everyone likes to laugh and everyone likes to cry. I don't care who you are. Everyone likes to laugh and everyone really likes to cry. Like a good cry can take you a long ways, and like a rom-com can really get you there. It can deliver both. And I mean, if you look, back at old stuff like Annie Hall or City Lights or other like older stuff. I mean, there's been a long streak of really good romantic comedies, but you're right. I guess we tend to forget about all the fat over time, and we all remember the diamonds in the rough. But there's a lot of rough.
Yeah, I mean, like, and then if we're just talking about comedy, like the very broad genre of just comedy, I mean, we just got that new Kevin Spacey movie, 9 Lives, which looks like a joke. And it's so easy to just instantly come up with like some stupid comedy idea, like meet Roger. Roger used to work at a zoo, but now he's at an aquarium. like that, it's so easy. It's so easy.
It is. And if it weren't for comedy, we wouldn't have Adam Sandler.
Meet Roger. He's got a twin sister that looks just like him. Oh, Roger.
Look you can watch Adam Sandler fart twice in the same scene as different people. I bet you didn't see that one coming. Look he fell down twice.
Oh my God, it's Adam Sandler and all his friends at a lake house. Oh, Adam Sandler.
All right, this is a funny story I like to tell about grown-ups. This must have been 2008 or 2009. I can't really remember. Maybe it was earlier. Maybe it was 2007. I don't remember. Whatever. Anyways, I remember. So me and my twin brother Spencer, we used to. We were down in LA one time, and my mom was getting shoes, and we ran into this woman, and she was an agent. And she's like, "Oh my God, like those are twins. Do you have any idea how hot of a commodity like kid twins are?" And so me and Spencer went down to LA a couple times a year, and we would audition. And I remember one of the scripts we auditioned for was something called The Lake House, and it was not a Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock movie. It's not that Lake House. It was something that was going to star Adam Sandler, Kevin James, David Spade, Rob Schneider, and I don't know who else is there. Selma Hayek.
Yeah,
she needed a paycheck, and then I was thinking, oh, cool. I mean, all the kids I know really like Adam Sandler. I don't really watch any of his movies, but that's cool. And so we auditioned for that movie, and it was called The Lake House. And then we saw previews for this movie called Grown Ups, and I was thinking, oh my God, that's The Lake House. And that's the story of how I auditioned for Grown Ups.
Without even knowing it, it was a trap.
It's a trap.
That's a trap.
Yeah. True story.
Wow, Connor, I wouldn't be friends with you if you had been in Grown Ups.
We auditioned for the character of young Lenny. I don't know who the character Lenny is in that movie, but if I was like young Kevin James, that'd be a weird thing to be. If I auditioned for a young Adam Sandler, then I'm not surprised I didn't get the role because I'm not Jewish enough.
Wow. Okay. So this is the story of Connor auditioning for a movie. Epic. Never done that before.
No.
So, do we have anything else that we wanted to touch on before the end of this?
I didn't really have anything else. What did you have?
I was just going to bring up something I just randomly thought of. One of my favorite movies is King Kong, but I'm just like a person that has an obsession with anything King Kong, because I think that's like a story where like you literally can just take it, insert it in a different time period, and it's instantly different. But I love King Kong, and that's kind of a movie that is an adventure film, but also kind of a science fiction film, because I guess a island of dinosaurs and giant gorillas, I think that's kind of a science fiction idea.
Would that be fantasy more?
It could be. Yeah, that's the thing. I was just debating in my head, what is King Kong? Is it science fiction adventure? Is it science fiction fantasy? Is it like, I don't know. It's very strange, because if it were, I would say a group of people in the 1930s that go to an island where dinosaurs are not yet extinct, I would kind of say that kind of sounds like a science fiction movie.
That is. But that also has a bit of like, film was such an escape for that particular audience, Great Depression era audience. And so, it was about these people who were going to make a movie, which was such a luxurious idea of people that make movies. Could you imagine how amazing that might be? And it's a movie about people making movies. These people are so incredible, and they're off to this crazy magical land where dinosaurs still exist. And so these people who make dreams into movies, like, these people that make dreams, they're going to this world that could only really exist within the recesses of somebody's mind, and it's literalized on screen. And that's kind of fantastical, though, I would say. But you're right, it does have a bit of a science fiction edge to it when you phrase it that way.
Yeah.
So I guess depending on how the director could play that, it could be a fantasy or more of a sci-fi element.
It's weird. I think it's a science fiction premise played as a fantasy.
Yeah, that's all in direction.
Yeah, because I mean, Peter Jackson's King Kong, that's one of the coolest things about that, is that it's very mystical the way it's treated. It's like a lost island covered in the fog with a giant wall. Like, it sounds like a lot of fantasy. And there's like a map. They're following a map, which is kind of an adventure thing, but you could also kind of put that in like a fantasy genre a little bit. I don't know. Yeah, it's very strange. King Kong.
It's also a part romance and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love King Kong. The original King Kong is one of my favorite movies. I just have a really soft spot for giant monsters. I love giant monsters. I'm not too big into Japanese culture. It's just not necessarily something where their entertainment doesn't really appeal to me. But kaiju is one of my favorite things ever. I've seen every single Godzilla movie. Godzilla vs. Monster Zero is one of the best movies ever made. Shut up, it is. It is amazing. But I also love Gamera. I love King Kong. I just have a soft spot for giant monsters. So King Kong is kind of the godfather of the giant monster.
Yeah.
At least on film. And I really like it.
I love King Kong. I agree. I love kaiju films as well.
You know what King Kong is in Japanese?
No.
Kinju Kanju.
That's epic.
Yeah. Kinju Kanju versus Gojira.
Awesome. Godzilla actually means like, I think Godzilla means like, is it like, it's like whale gorilla?
Yeah, like gorilla whale or something.
Something like that. Or maybe it's like bear. I think it's like gorilla whale or something like that.
I know there's a whale in there for sure. I know that much.
Yeah. So, I guess that's all we had for this episode, guys. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another episode of Socratic Circle Cinema.